Historian for the last 5 years. He's been on the board of directors of the Perinton Historical Society for many years. I don't even know how many. And every November, he hosts our wonderful presentation. He's already given this once this evening, and I can assure you, you're in for a treat, as always, for Bill Poray's Dr. Dean presentation.
Thank you. Talk amongst yourselves for a moment. I thought she was going to help me. Do you remember when CBS came to town and they did a story for the Sunday morning show? And it happened to be based on a column that I did, and fortunately they picked it up, and it was about this wonderful family and a World War II veteran. And the reason I'm telling you this is, what's the name of the CBS host for, Irene, help me. Steve Hartman. You know Steve Hartman? Yeah. So Steve Hartman, this reminded me of this. He sits me down, it's just Steve Hartman and a cameraman, and he starts powdering my nose for the camera, Steve Hartman. And I said, I always imagined this would be a cute young lady that would do this. And he says, so did I. Thank you for coming. It's great to do this. It's great to have you here. I'm honored that you keep coming back for these things. Yuletide upstairs, I encourage you to buy the Christmas trees so that my wife doesn't get them, because we already have a vast collection of Yuletide Christmas trees. I'm hoping for the edible prizes up there. That's my hope. I'm going to talk about Dr. Dean and Mrs. Dean. That's George and Louise Griswold Dean. If you knew either one of them, would you indicate that you did? Did anyone know Dr. Dean or his wife? Did you?
Yeah. Treated me with allergy shots.
He was a terrific allergist.
Yeah.
Good. Anybody else? Wow, just one. We had quite a few in the... He was the school doctor. He had a lot of opportunities out there in the community. Now, I ran into a couple ladies upstairs earlier when we first started tonight, and they said they were crybabies. That means they were delivered by Dr. Cry. And Dr. Cry had a huge following. You know, you're very connected to that physician you had as a kid. And someday maybe we'll do a presentation on Dr. Cry. We started out with the idea of doing the Dean presentation as much as anything because we received this vast collection from the Dean family, actually a grandchild, of many boxes, cartons of important archives from the Dean family. Photographs, mementos, letters, journals, diaries, documents. And when I started to go through it, I thought, oh my gosh, this couple was amazing. And they were passionate about life. And that theme kept coming back to me, the passion that they had. And in fact, you know, they don't look that passionate there, but they do here. And one of them sent this to the other as part of their correspondence, probably when he was off in medical school and she was off in an apartment in New York. We'll talk more about that. But this kind of really illustrates where they saw their life going. All about sailing ships, both of them, over the course of their lives. And it even looks a little bit like them to me. And one of them, someone put the name George Garwood up there, and yo-ho. It seems like there's a ho missing to me. It's usually yo-ho-ho, right? But I thought, well, that's a good, passionate way to start. Now, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to go over each one of these a little bit biographically. First, Louise, and then George, and then we'll get more into some of the more illustrative things. But I want to give you a feel for just who these people were. Louise was born in Warren, Ohio in 1905. And her maiden name was Griswold. And she lived in a lot of places. Her family was in Ohio, Florida. She spent time in Maine. She spent time in Europe. She wound up in New York State. In fact, graduated from Ithaca High School. And she did work in girls' camps in Maine for many, many years when she was a teenager. And that, I think, really fostered something in common that she had with George that we'll see as we go on. She went to Cornell University, graduated from Cornell, pretty close to a high school in Ithaca, right? Lived in New York City after graduation, worked as a secretary for a few years, and she married George in July of 1931. She did a lot more after that. Moved to Fairport, and she moved, in her words, and remember, this is back in the 30s, to start the life of a country doctor's wife. Really looking at Fairport as way out there in the country. Of course, this is a girl who just spent 3 years in New York City. 2 children, Andy and Barbie. And Louise died in 1995, 25 years after her husband. Here's a nice photo of Louise. And I think it is a bit illustrative of the passion that she had for life. I see a lot of passion in the photographs that she's in and the photographs that she took. She was a terrific photographer in the sense that, not in any professional sense, but this collection includes many photos that were clearly taken by her and others that were taken by George, but really some wonderful images. And she was a writer. And in the organizations that she was involved with and that she supported, she typically, one of her primary roles was as a writer, as a publicist for the newspapers, to get information out about charitable events and fund drives. And we benefited from her writing because this collection, as I said, has diaries and letters and correspondence, so much writing. Very active in the Congregational Church here in Fairport. She was a Red Cross volunteer for over 70 years. That started as a teenager folding bandages in World War I. And in all these different places that she moved, she jumped right back in and volunteered again. You know, we get the sense, someone was talking to me earlier and they said, these days it seems like volunteerism for a lot of people, it seems to be something that they say, well, once I retire, I'll get busy being a volunteer. These were people that volunteered when their lives were their most busy. She really spearheaded and was one of the driving forces of the Fairport Perinton Youth Commission, our first initiatives to find things for kids to do, playgrounds, parks, activities. Before that, there was nothing organized. Now maybe we have too much organized. She helped to establish the first playgrounds in Fairport. And she was hands-on involved in those activities. Hands-on to the degree that she spent hundreds of hours on the playgrounds. Not just creating them, but supporting them. She was a Cub Scout and Girl Scout leader, supporting her children, involved in the community chest, community fund drive. She was involved with the Parent-Teacher Association, so many different activities that she did. Again, a lot of times these days, it seems like a lot of people, they pick something, and that's what they do. These folks were doing everything. She volunteered at Genesee Hospital, and that was important to her. That's where her husband interned after he graduated from medical school. And she volunteered there for many, many years. And she was a member of the Perinton Historical Society and the Fairport Historical Club. Here she is behind her trusty typewriter. And here she is receiving the key to Fairport. Does anyone recognize the gentleman? Yes. Who is that? Pardon me? This? No. It looks a little like Bob. But it's not Bob. Okay, I'm sorry. It's Mayor Vince Canale. Does look a little like Bob. Now let's talk about George Adgate Dean. George was born in 1904 in Connecticut. He graduated from a high school in Buffalo in 1922. His parents had moved to Buffalo. That's where he went. When he was there, he gained the rank of Eagle Scout, and he was Buffalo's first Sea Scout. That was a Mariner-based program. I said the whole family was really involved in sailing and boating, and you'll see more examples of that, I think. He graduated from Cornell University with a pre-med degree. So both Louise and George went to Cornell. It seems clear that that's probably where they met. George had no reason to be in Ithaca before going to Cornell that I know of. He then went to University of Buffalo and graduated from med school there. We'll talk more about that. He completed his internship at Genesee Hospital, and he began a private practice in Fairport in the summer of 1930, right in the depths of the Depression. Great time to start up a new practice. He married Louise Griswold in July of 1931, a year after he started up in Fairport, and while starting a practice, while marrying, he decided it'd be a good idea to become a sergeant in the New York National Guard. So he did that. On top of that, in World War II, he was a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy, stationed at Sampson Base, where he was a surgeon there. He was the father of 2 children, Andy and Barbie, and he died too young in 1970. So he was only 66 years old. Here's a pretty neat photo of him. Probably stopped for a hot dog, a little sleuthing on my part. But I love the image, and it's a pretty early one. The cars are really helping us date the progression of some of these photographs. This is the earliest car that I saw him with. You'll enjoy some of his other cars as well. Other activities and responsibilities that George had, he was the Fairport Perinton health officer. We always had a community health officer. He was the school physician for thousands of children over many, many decades. Remember when we had a school physician, right? Public Health Nursing Committee. He was the physician that held the physician's chair in this special committee for nurses, and they really certainly appreciated having a physician involved. During the Depression, he was on the Citizens Relief Commission, and then as World War II began, he was the Village Welfare Committee representative. Very involved. Fairport Air Raid Casualty Service during the war. These two activities, they kind of make me think of Jimmy Stewart in It's a Wonderful Life. Remember, he was 4F on account of his ear, and he couldn't go off to war, and so he was doing that Air Raid Commission, recycling, all those activities. But then George did go off and serve as well. He was very active in the Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts, supporting his kids. And really his special skills medically were as an allergist. And he really made some breakthroughs that were pretty important in that field. And he had countless immunization clinics over many decades and really supported his community and Rochester in that endeavor. He was on the committee when Fairport first centralized schools because he had so much free time. So that would be around 1949, 1950 when they were first starting to decide that we had to move away from these dozen or so district schoolhouses and centralize. George was in on that. He was a deacon at the Congregational Church, and he was on the Holiday Fair Committee, just for something light and fun. And finally, he was a member here and a board member for a little while of the Perinton Historical Society. So we feel a special connection to both George and Louise as well. I show you a map because I want to relay to you a story that was told to me by a woman who's probably about 85 years old or so. And I tried to listen to as many people as I could for their stories about the Deans. And one of those stories involved this 85-year-old woman remembering back when she was about a 5 or 6-year-old girl. And she lived down here on South Avenue. This is Church Street. Do you all know where the Deans lived for many, many years and where his office was? Do you know where the Inn on Church is? That was their home, 11 West Church Street, and that was his office for most of the time that he was a physician here. So that's where this little red line winds up, 11 West Church Street. Little girl, she told me, is an 85-year-old lady, didn't feel good one day. She said, Mommy, my stomach hurts. I've got to go to the doctor. And her mom's holding the baby. And she said, I can't take you to the doctor. I'm busy here. You can take yourself to the doctor. So they're down here at the corner of Clinton Street, not too far, unless you're 5 and taking yourself to the doctor. So she walked up South Avenue, got to church, took a right, went up to the doctor's office, marched in, said, I'm here to see Dr. Dean. They sat her down, got her in to see the doctor eventually. He examined her, gave her a prescription. Actually had the medicine on hand, so sent her home with a prescription that said, take 2 every 5 minutes. He gave her a bag of candy. When I heard that, I thought, I like this guy. I want to study this guy. Here's George Dean as a Boy Scout. He's a teenager. He's got the whole uniform on, except interestingly, he has a striped long tie on. Not regulation, but looks pretty sharp. And he's in this mountainous terrain, and here's Louise. Looks like I could take this center out and they'd be in the same place, but they're not. She is in the middle of climbing Mount Washington, and here he is, I'm betting, off in the Adirondacks. And these photos are illustrative of what part of their shared passion was. The wilderness, the camping, canoeing, going off on a Friday afternoon and throwing their canoe on the car and driving off to the Adirondacks and just finding a lake and dumping their canoe in, maybe not even knowing what the lake was, and then finding a campsite. I read one item in one of their journals that said they had to move their campsite because where they set it up, they were immediately infested with bees. Oh, no problem, throw everything back into the canoe, go a little bit further down the shore. Now, we've said that they both went to Cornell, and George graduated a bit earlier. He was a couple of years older, and he went off to medical school in Buffalo. Now, how many college students today have letterheads, have their own printed stationery, or even write? So this is not an indication, by the way, that George came from a wealthy family. He did not. This was just the proper way that he was raised and the way things were for folks like him at this time. He wrote his parents a letter from Buffalo to Buffalo because that's where he lived and that's where they lived. And he wrote this letter, says, Dear folks, I'm sorry to have not written sooner, but I've been pretty busy lately. The brass company has been going full blast with a wad of new men, all of whom find it necessary to get to the first aid room within the first week of being hired. School has started, and I've already attended lectures and started monkeying around in the physiology department. So he's talking about working in a brass factory. He's going to school, med school, but he's also working sometimes 2 or 3 jobs to put himself through medical school. His parents' house is in the middle up there in Buffalo, and it's a nice place, but it's not an extravagant place. Researching his family, I learned that his father was an artist. And in fact, here's his name on this cover of Field and Stream magazine, John Renfrew Dean. He did a lot of covers for Field and Stream, for which I believe he was not paid much. You can still find these magazines out there, and you can find, I think it'd be pretty neat for somebody in the family to have a copy of that magazine, wouldn't it? So George needed to put himself through school, and when he was at school, he tended to have a pretty good sense of humor. Like in this case, palling around with this skeleton, and look, he's got a skeleton for a leg. I'm not sure what's going on with his hair there. There's something there too. There's a partner to this picture right here. And I don't want to look at that very long or think about it very hard, although it looks like a part to a body. Now we talked about the brass company. Here, George writes a letter to Louise, February 29th, 1928, on American Brass Company letterhead of Buffalo, New York. And George says, "Dear Saintess Valentine." How many of you have ever been called Saintess Valentine? Shy? This is just to show you that I can hook employers' stationery as well as some other people I know. Also, that I've learned to typewrite more or less. The well-known Hunt and Peck system, and it is not infallible. That's what comes of typing lecture notes. George says, "I hope the flowers," Valentine's Day was 2 weeks previous to this letter, "I hope the flowers were not wilted. They looked all right at this end of their trip." Now he seems to be thinking to the future when he says, "What does a secretary secrete? If the course prepares for physician's office attendance, I can offer you a job in about 10 years. It requires a good-looking feminine person who can quiet the aggrieved patient that's trying to bring malpractice suits and other unpleasant things of the like." Good sense of humor, I think. The Brass Company, by the way, is still in business. Now, this is a photograph of the ambulance at Genesee Hospital in 1929. George is not in this picture, but he did work on this ambulance, one of his side jobs while interning. We've all heard of how busy physicians who are interning in hospitals are, right? George worked side jobs while interning, was this ambulance. And he would go out on calls, and he documented those, and it sounded like the people in the ambulance retrieving patients were in as much physical danger as the patients may have been. Sounded like a very dangerous occupation. Here's a more pleasant scene. George delivered twins at Genesee Hospital one day and stopped for this wonderful picture. And it made me think, this is about 1929, those twins might be around. I wonder where they are. I wonder who they are. Wouldn't that be fun? George writes on hospital letterhead this time, 1930. He writes to his parents, "I've heard of several excellent opportunities in the several small towns around here besides Fairport," indicating he's already considering Fairport, "and plan to take a Sunday off for investigation when the pressure lets up, which will not be soon." So he's thinking about, what am I going to do when my internship's over? Where can I get a job? Where can I get a practice? And what was happening at the time, at the depths of the Great Depression, about the only way he was going to get a practice was to inherit one from a retiring physician. He learned of a retiring physician in Fairport and was able to acquire that practice. This is what South Main Street in Fairport looked like at about that time. Some recognizable things. You see the First Baptist Church off in the distance? We're looking to the south. This was the home of a doctor that would live right across the street from George and Louisa's place. That would be Dr. Price. Later on, that was the home of Judge Wagner and his wife Winnie. He did just pass away. A real loss for the community. He was quite a man. Now, these two corresponded endlessly, and we are benefiting from that because we have much of the correspondence. In this case, George sent a correspondence to 343 West End Avenue, New York City. So, of course, I could have driven to New York City to go find that building, but it turns out you can do it in your computer in like 15 seconds on Google Maps, and this is the building that she lived in when he sent this letter. Not a bad-looking place, right? Imagine what it goes for today to rent an apartment there. But she was there with a girlfriend. And Louise, at that address, wrote George back a poem. And I imagine that this fireplace might be something like she had in her apartment when she wrote, "Our tiny fireplace gives us heat. Of logs, we give it none. But still apartment life is cheered. We burn the New York sun. Each twisted page a stick of wood. They blaze forth one by one. How could we bear the city nights without the New York sun? You have to like these people. Now, George did come to Fairport, set up his practice. How many people had a doctor named Dr. Cry? And someone, as I said, maybe told me that they considered themselves crybabies then. You're a crybaby. Well, this was Dr. Cry's place, right? But before it was Dr. Cry's home and office, briefly, it was the home and office of Dr. Dean. He rented a room there and rented the physician's office because it served as a physician's office for many doctors before Dr. Cry. And so once again, we have a letterhead, 84 South Avenue, and he's writing to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Why Pennsylvania? Louise's family wound up landing near Pittsburgh. So George writes the Marriage License Bureau. Gentlemen, will you kindly inform me as to whether a marriage in your state may be performed on the same day the license is obtained, or whether some time will elapse between, or must elapse? If the last is necessary, please advise as to how long this must be. This is a man who wants to get married right away. Right? This is a man who wants to get on with the next stage of his life. In the meantime, just like that little girl's prescription, he wrote a prescription to Louise. Patient's name, Louis Beloved. He called her Louis. Address, far away. Age, yes. He says the prescription includes extract of silver moonbeams, stardust crystals, an open fireplace, cold hands, and a cold nose. Mix and serve in an ice wagon as much as can be procured as often as possible. Kind of like the candy. Pretty sentimental guy. George wrote to Louise about a patient he had upon arriving in Fairport. One of my maternity cases has up and gotten married after I talked to her and her husband like a fatherly Dutch uncle. And Saturday morning, early of course, we all got together and had a baby. I really did feel very fatherly as the now happy parents are each 17 years old. This is 1930. It's the Depression. Imagine those kids and what they were going through. The economic times, how people were looking at them. And to have this physician be that supportive and find a way to try to help make it work for them and do what he could for that couple. It's really nice. Louise writes to George from the sunken garden, which tells us that her apartment was probably right there. Beloved and dearest, your masterly drawings have me all enthused. I suppose if the cellar stairs would be in the way, they would have to be moved. Still, might they not be an advantage in case the doctor's orders wanted patients to shovel coal? What they're talking about is George found another place for them to set up their home and his office. And they're clearly starting to talk about the next stage of their life. George writes, we should have been together years before this. I suppose it's really better that we didn't, because I'd be spending all of my time with you, and my patients would be dying like flies, or worse yet, recovering without my help. Now, I'm going to go back for a minute. George tried to get a marriage license as quickly as he could. He had his ideas, and his ideas were partly founded on what his views were coming to this little small town and taking on this desperate practice of a lot of poor people who couldn't even pay him. And he had a need to fulfill. And he wrote that to Louise in a letter. My idea in coming out to the country is that there's really a need for a physician. Not exactly so much economic room for one, as really a physical need. I never expect to be a millionaire or perhaps not even comfortably wealthy. I've got a job to do, and that's cure if I can, alleviate if I can't, and the cash is secondary, as long as I make a living. I'm not trying to be a philanthropist, but I have something that people need, whether they can or cannot pay for it. And it's my job to supply it. Often enough, the only reward will be the satisfaction of a job well done, but that's good enough. He wrote that to this girl in this basement apartment in New York. I sent this to my doctor. And he loved it. And he got back to me and he said he forwarded it to all the physicians that he networks with. He said it was inspiring. George wrote this, and then he must have put down his pen for a while, and he had to go back to business. And I'm imagining that, did you ever do that when you would write a letter? Well, I'll get back to it and finish it up. He came back to it and he said, P.S. It strikes me this is a particularly asinine sort of a letter, probably written by a jackass. Same guy wrote that. And then on the topic of marriage, he said, as far as the wedding goes, just do what you think best, or better yet, exactly as you please. I am with you no matter what you decide. The important thing is the end and not the means. A few more loads of love, George. He didn't really want this big society wedding, but then he realized it's a partnership. They got married in Pennsylvania, and you might say it was a bit of a society wedding. They covered the before, the during, the after, and there they were. It does say the society page. So they had a wonderful wedding, and they came back to Fairport. And this is where they came, to 61 South Main Street, an address, a home that no longer exists, and very few of you probably have any memory of. It was torn down many decades ago. It was torn down to build Church Motors, which now is Howard Hannon, and before that it was Nothnagel, and before that there was a restaurant there. It's been many things. But it was built to be Church Motors, a car dealership. And so when they built that, they tore down 65 right here, and then a great house that was on the corner, 1953. Here's another image of the house, which is really a wonderful early Fairport home. And Louise got a picture of it before she moved there. George provided her with a photograph. And she said, in the center of town, with all those windows, I expect we would have to buy a large number of curtains or else behave quite properly. People aren't so different over the last 80 years, are they? She also said some soundproofing might be needed. Because she says, twixt the kitchen and the office, that's where the soundproofing needs to be. Because my idea of kitchen activity is much rattling of pans. She refers to her cooking many times in our collection, and none of her references are positive. Here they are on the front step of their new place and ready to take on the world in Fairport with this new practice. Now here's a photograph of the garage, which was just on the north side of the house. And an interesting detail, looks like a graveyard back there. It's not a graveyard. The folks in this house sold monuments, gravestones. So that was a fun detail to come across. And researching that, we found that they indeed, all the way from about 1919 or so to about 1950, sold gravestones out of the backyard of their house. Small business. Now, Louise did a running journal. She kept such wonderful notes of their lives. George did too, but Louise exceptionally so. Across the street was the bank, which is still there. You recognize it? And this is the home, wonderful home that was lost to urban renewal of, at the time, Dr. Price, later Judge Wagner and his wife Winnie. And so this is what they looked out and saw. And she wrote about their home, about the home of the Deans. Our little house has been much warmer and of even temperature this winter. For a lean-to, it's been surprisingly windproof. These last 2 days, the thermometer has started at 45 and 50 degrees, respectively, in the morning in the living room. By noon, it has gotten up to 50 and 55 degrees. Last night, by 9 o'clock, it was all the way up to 61. There was snow on the floor in front of all the doors yesterday morning. That's the inside of the doors. And a line of snow frozen on 1 or 2 of the window curtains where the wind blew through the weather, through our colonial system of ventilation. However, that only happens on the very windy days. Ordinarily, the curtains just blow gently when the windows are closed. All you fans of old houses. Now, Louise here has made a list over a period of 3 years of all classes and types of patients. This is the 30s. It is a bit of a different time. And so she's listed many things. Number 1, lawyer, wife and daughter. Number 2, doctor's son. Many different categories, including... Pick some out and have fun with them. There's a murderer. Where? 55. Murderer. Bootlegger. Italians, Canadians, English, Dutch, Polish. Washwomen. Finally, in handwriting down here, it's just cut off. It says housewives. Oh, yes. Here's George out in front of one of his cars with his doctoring bag. And you see the little medical insignia. A big part of their life was house calls. House calls. In fact, one note that I read indicated that they got a call, kind of an emergency call, to go out in the middle of winter, of course, way out to South Perinton in the hills, 9 o'clock at night. They drive out through a blizzard, get to the house, do what they could. They got back at midnight, and there were a line of patients outside the house waiting for him. Hadn't even had dinner yet. Priorities are priorities. Here's George shoveling out his car so he could go on one of those house calls. You recognize where they are? If you don't, here's the Fairport Credit Union, same building. Here is the funeral home. Looks a little different. Here's the Cry House where George first was. And here's the First Baptist Church. Nice picture, isn't it? And think, I mean, not only is George out there shoveling the snow, Louise is out there taking the picture. And photography then wasn't what it is today, right? That's snow right there. Look at those snowbanks. Now,
Global warming, right?
where do you think we are here? That is a common belief, and you are right in that it is a north-south road. It wasn't labeled, but we were able to figure out where it was. There's a little house here, and there's something big way up on the hill. And that something big helped us. There's the house blown up, and there's the big thing up there. And I recognized it as one of our Perinton landmarks. That beautiful house is across the street from Eagle Vale on Route 250. So we are looking south on Route 250. Penfield is back this way. Penfield Road intersects 3/4 of a mile up this way. Now do you know where you are? Yeah. Louise, going on house calls, sitting frigid in this car, supporting her husband and writing her journal. Here I am, covered with melting snow from hat to galoshes, sitting in the car, anchored to the top of a snowdrift. Poor George just disappeared into the house, half a mile up the hill, where he had to walk with his heavy black bag. It's just noon now, and all this has been happening since we left home at 10:30 to go on this call. A nice old lady who has had a stroke was ill because her house caught fire last night. Nice old lady, but she certainly lives in an unholy location for winter traffic, we being the only traffic noted. Here's George trudging up on a house call. Not only did Louise leave the car, she came up to take the picture. And I don't know where this one was. I haven't been able to identify the house yet.
Almost looks like a vineyard or an orchard there.
Of which there were many more back then. But yes, you can imagine that maybe this is up on Turk Hill. Don't know. This is on Turk Hill. I just mentioned the winery up there, Casa Larga. This place was a schoolhouse just south of Casa Larga. And it was on the corner of a road called Foley Road that doesn't exist anymore. Used to be a road that went right from Turk Hill right down to Mosley Road, right down the hill. And this schoolhouse was on the corner, and it looks like this today. You've seen this place. So you can pick out the part that was the schoolhouse. And I show you this because Louise not only went on house calls, she went off to the one-room schoolhouses with George for the annual physicals of the children. And she kept track of what was going on. She would type a sheet for each child to fill in the vital information, and George would say the name of the child, height, weight, measurements of the chest, eyes, ears, etc. And then she kept a few extra notes. Country school, September 1934. School physical examination required by the state. Schoolroom about 1/3 filled. School is warm and light, 13 pupils. One second grader didn't come to school because he knew there was to be physical exams and that the doctor was coming. Good day to stay home. How many remember school physical exams? Not like for athletics, but just because it happened. And the dentist too, right? I just remember standing around in my underwear. Now, when George and Louise finally got the opportunity, their passion was the great outdoors. And they loved their canoe, and they loved camping, and this was their escape. And here they are in their canoe. They would often go to the Adirondacks, and they would just pick a place to go. They'd get a rough idea, and then they'd follow the roads, and they'd find a lake, and they'd find a place to launch, and they'd start paddling, and they'd find a place to camp. It wasn't very scientific. It was fun. It was an adventure. And here in this notation, they're getting ready to leave their home to go to the Adirondacks. After 2 Teamsters cups of coffee, I'm deciphering that that's a really strong cup of coffee. One before and one after dressing, the last-minute packing was finished. A sign, "We'll be back on Friday," was typed and put in the office door. With quite the opposite of reluctance, we locked the doors, made a dive for the car, already loaded at midnight last night. Of course, the top of the cabaret was down, the convertible top, for we had put the canoe across the top, resting on the rumble seat and the windshield. So, if you don't know, the rumble seat was basically a seat that popped out of the trunk, and they propped up the canoe over the windshield and the rumble seat. This is, of course, how we move a canoe today. This is a more methodical way of moving a canoe, but it would be nice to be able to see what George and Louise did. And there it is. Now, if it rains, you stay dry. And you had the running boards to carry your extra equipment. So it was pretty handy. They even went to the details in their notes, in their journals, to point out, you see this white here? They referred to this white cotton fabric that they put on the windshield and back here in order to cushion the canoe, to not damage the canoe or the car, except that as they drove down the road, this fabric fell apart and they were pelted with cotton shards for the first 100 miles. Now they're at camp, and here's Louise just peeking out of that tent. Remember those canvas tents? Woke up at 5:30. This is George writing. Woke up at 5:30, squirmed quietly so as not to wake Louis, whose nose just stuck out of the blankets. Dozed off and on until 6:30, got up and built fire and made Teamster's cup of coffee. Woke up Louise, somewhat indignant, okay after seeing the coffee. I wouldn't dare wake up my wife before noon if I didn't have coffee. Dressed and had breakfast in an hour, bacon, crackers, and tomato juice, and more coffee with canned milk. They loved adventure, and it didn't matter what season it was. So many of these photographs are in the dead of winter. It looks like she's trudging across a frozen lake. George way up on a mountain. Lots of pictures of Louise. Some folks pointed out they know where this road is, right up around Inlet. Louise in her canoe, here near the Stillwater Reservoir. So they really enjoyed this time of their life, and they shared this with their children later. They would all go as a family and continue this tradition for many, many years. Now, in 1937, March, that's when they learned that a house was going to come on the market. And it was 11 West Church Street, where the inn on Church Street is today, right? And this is the place. And a notation. On Monday night, our notary public and laundryman, it was the Depression, told us about a house at 11 West Church Street that his boss had on a list for sale. So they had this opportunity to get this house. And George went over and looked at it, and Louise went and looked at it, and it was much bigger, and they almost referred to it as a modern house compared to the one that they were in. And Louise made a list of things she won't miss about where they are currently at 65 South Main Street. Things we won't miss, but we'll leave with glee. The sound of bowling balls from the alley 2 doors away. Sound of noisy cars that leave the curb in front of the house after midnight from the bowling alley. The sound of thousands of trucks, autos, and noisy people going by at all times of the day and night, especially in the summer when the windows are open. Now, where their house was right here, next door to this store that sold radios and small appliances. You see gas pumps right on the curb. That's where they were back then. And the gas pumps were in front of the bowling alley. So that's how close it was to their house. Here, in this image from another collection, we see the village hall to give you bearings of where we are. And then we see a 3-story brick building, which is now a 2-story brick building. That's Fairport Savings and Loan. It lost a floor. This is the 30s. This is about 1937. It lost a floor, I think, in the 40s. Then we see the bowling alley, gas station, catch-all shop, then the radio store. So that's where we are. And again, their house would be just right here. That, by the way, is the Fairport High School Marching Band in 1937. Here we see from across the street from Dr. Price's property, here is what is the bank today, Fairport Savings and Loan, with 1 story less today. And then there's that bowling alley. You see how deep the building is? Needs to be for a bowling alley, doesn't it? Now, they got the house, and it tells us about it right here. Very quickly now, only about a week or 10 days has passed. George and I have bought a house, 11 West Church Street, Fairport, New York. The bank has been very liberal, or we could never have dreamed of doing it. We are very much excited. Great house, great great, big, wonderful, important house. Great place to start that home and to have children. Now, she comments on some of George's observations on the pending move. George thinks it will be a change for the good, not having to spend half of our time looking all over for sticks to prop up the windows, as we have for the past 6 years. How many have ever propped up a window with a stick? Also, we will no longer clutch at the dark in the middle of the night, trying to find a string to turn on the light in the ceiling. The new house has switch buttons. Excuse me. So they're pretty excited about this move. Lots of photos ensued of the construction of the doctor's quarters in the first floor of the house. But this picture really excited me. This is the barn behind the Dean house. But this is a photograph that we had never seen before. It provides information and details we had never seen before. Because the pictures that we had prior to this look like this. There's the barn, the primary part of the barn, and there is an outline of where the back of the barn was, but we didn't see it. Here, not only do we see the rest of the barn, but we see an outhouse with 2 doors, little shed. So we got to see a lot more. We see the remnants of corn growing in the back field. So that was kind of exciting, all these different pictures that we see from the collection. We even see the First Baptist Church. That great proximity to the 4 corners of Fairport. Here's a photograph from the 2nd floor of the house looking to the south. And so if you get your bearings where you are, you're looking to the south. The first street you would come to is Clinton Place. These are the houses on Clinton Place. The next street back would be George Street. And then way up here, this hill, is Brooks Hill. Fairly barren. How many people ever sledded on Brooks Hill? Anyone? I don't want to really raise my hand. A little more treacherous now. There's a lot more trees.
See the path to the outhouse in the snow there?
Ah, yes. Very good. Very good. Path to the outhouse.
Yes.
George relocated his sign, Dr. George Dean, MD, and he relocated his snow brush because no matter where you are, you got snowed in Fairport. And I'm wondering if he really had an important place to go because they really enlisted some help to get the doctor out. When you've got to go, you've got to go. First Baptist Church in the background. Nice picture. No more convertible, at least not at this point. I don't know how they put that canoe up there. Here's George doing some work around the house between seeing patients. He's got his tie on while he's pulling down a tree. Here he's hustling around with a wheelbarrow. Here he's cutting the grass. Dressed in dress shoes, cuffed pants, and his tie. With that beautiful First Baptist Church steeple over his shoulder. Now here's George and Louise with the 2 kids, Andy and Barbie, and the 2 grandmas. So that's a nice family picture with the porch at 11 West Church just in the background. And here's a picture that I love that I'm sure Louise took. And the caption of the photo on the back said that they were watching a bulldozer on the other side of the fence. But what a nice picture of the kids and George up on that old rickety ladder. Luckily, there was a doctor nearby if they needed one. Now, during World War II, George served as a lieutenant commander in the Navy, stationed at the Sampson base along Seneca Lake. And this is a copy of their newsletter. And it actually talks about, this is a little biography of Dr. Dean, who was really a wonderful allergist and really cut new ground in that field. And it goes on to talk about Dr. Dean and his wrestling career at UB. So not only was he in medical school, not only was he working 2 or 3 jobs, he was on the wrestling team. Now, Dr. Dean was not a large man. I think he was about 5'6", and he wrestled in a pretty lightweight class. This story goes on to talk about how in 1927 he won his weight class at this big wrestling tournament, and then he really wasn't tired, so he signed up and he wrestled at the other weight classes too, including the heaviest, over 200 pounds, and he won every one. I think they told this story in the naval newspapers so that all the guys would stay right in line. Here's a picture from the collection of the Sampson Training Center bus. The picture on the right, I believe George is with his brother on the base, who also served. And here he is. I imagine he's getting he's getting ready to leave home. He's in the driveway here at 11 West Church. And Barbie's got her little Navy outfit on as well. And both the kids had them. And he's saying goodbye to the family. Although after a while, the family relocated with him and lived in quarters on the base. Now, George wasn't even supposed to go serve. He was termed essential. And when you were termed essential, you couldn't serve. But George found a loophole. He said, what if I find a doctor to take my place? Then can I serve? And they said, if you can find a doctor, good luck. Sure, you can serve. He found a retired physician willing to move into the house and take over the practice until he got back from the war. And George went down to Sampson and eventually took his family down there. They lived in this home. A lady in the first group this evening said, I know that place. I'm going to go take a picture of it and send it to you. It's still there. And the quarters of Lieutenant Commander Dean. And there's the kids, ready to serve as well. Here they are in a 4th of July parade on the East Lake Road. You can just make out the lake between the houses. And they were marching in their 4th of July parade, supporting the war effort and their country, and all dressed up and ready to go. Got time for a few more photos? Yes. Just a few. So many great photos, I really had to pick and choose. But some of the photos were of our area, and I wanted to share them. This is the West Shore Railroad overpass, or underpass, take your pick, by Baird Road. It was built in 1938. This is 1938. And who knew that this detour for Route 33B, who knew Baird Road is Route 33B? Not me. Brand new. This is a construction train up here supporting the effort. Before this was constructed, there was an ancient rickety overpass that you had to wind through while school children were winding through and walking on their way to the Midvale School. So this was considered to be a great step forward. The underpass garage is here on the corner of Baird Road. Do you know where Shooters is? This is that building. Where Fairport Hots is it Fairport Hots or Perinton Hots there? Fairport, this is that building. The underpass garage, does anybody know a guy by the name of Carl Green? Greene. I talked about him when I talked about, what talk was it? The lift bridge, when we had the lift bridge celebration. And I said Carl Green was a little boy that went down to the village on his tricycle. And then he rode onto the lift bridge, and then the lift bridge went up. And then he went right off the end of the lift bridge. And then he got in trouble when he got home. Yeah. Oh, and by the way, he was like 3. So anyway, Carl Green's dad owned this place. It was his underpass garage, and he was the first person to own an airplane in Perinton. And he used to fly it out of the field on Marsh Road, just past Whitehaven Cemetery. And first plane owner in Perinton. And he had it, and he didn't have a license yet, because, you just had to practice. And he went up one day. Now, Carl's telling me this. By the way, Carl is 97 or 98 years old. He's the guy at the town hall that delivers the big, huge pumpkins every year that you can guess the weight of the pumpkin. 98 years old. He brings a 600-pound pumpkin in the back of his pickup truck. So he's telling me, yeah, my dad had this plane, But he came down one day, landed in a farm field, and one of the wheels hit a rock, and the plane tipped over. And my mom said, "Get rid of that plane." And that was the end of his piloting career. This photo is of one of our busiest intersections in Perinton. This is Route 31, and this is Mosley Road, and this is Hannon's Corners. So Wegmans, Perinton, would be right over here. We're looking west. This is about 1950. Sleepy little place, right?
So where did the road go? That's not, like now there's a Walgreens right here, but where did that road go to the left?
This road goes south up towards, yeah, that's just Mosley Road, 250 going south.
Oh, 250, okay.
Yeah, we're looking west. Here is George, who apparently knew how to fix a seaplane while it is resting in the canal, because this appears to be the canal. You see the cement wall?
Yeah.
Now around here, the only cement wall that I know of like that is around Bushnell's Basin and the Great Embankment. So this is a rowboat named Janet. So I looked for a Janet in 1930 and 1940 census, and I found a kid named Janet living in a house in Pittsburgh that backed up to the canal. So I'm thinking maybe that's her rowboat, but I haven't really nailed it down yet. But they needed the rowboat to get to the plane, I'm thinking. So we don't really know more about it. I thought I would have found a newspaper story about it. I talked about Louise and how she was so involved with the playgrounds and the Youth Recreation Commission. And here she is. Do you recognize these schools? This is the West Avenue School, the back of the West Avenue School. And this is the back of the old West Church Street School with the athletic field in between. Our museum is like right there. That's where we are. This photo, obviously of the Village Hall, but it wasn't the Village Hall then, it was the Town Hall. The village had a little window up there, village clerk. And this was naturally one of Louise's endeavors to support the community chest that she was the publicist for and so involved. Fire station to the right, where the police station is today. And we talked about the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts. And George was very involved in supporting his son. And there were a collection of photographs trying to figure out where they were taken. This one and this one. This was a good clue because Troop 207 built a cabin. Found the newspaper stories that said that they were built on the Jensen's farm on Turk Hill Road. So we are up in the hills where the Indian Hill Crescent Trail hiking area is. That's where we are. And look at the stenciling on the boards. We know what that is, right? That's old boxcar lumber from East Rochester. You could take they would tear down the old boxcars, and you could take the old wood home, big, thick oak planks, and reuse them. The oxbow was filled with old boxcar lumber. Some of you, if you have a 1920s, 30s, even 1940s garage on your property, if you live in the village of Fairport, if you go inside and look at the underside, you might see some stenciling. You've got boxcar lumber from East Rochester. Somebody does. It's all over the place. Here are George and his son Andy on a recycling drive in a big way in their driveway. Now I said George wasn't a very tall man. He's standing way up on a tall platform, and they've got newspapers, boxes, all kinds of things in this flatbed truck out in front of the barn that's still there today at 11 West Church Street. Here is a lemonade stand that looks more like a concentration camp. And it is right in front of where the Fairport Brew Pub is today, the old Pure Oil gas station. And here's where they are. We're looking north. So the old movie theater with its marquee is right there. So naturally, we need to know what that says. That helps us to understand when this was taken and what was happening. They probably sold lemonade to the people that were coming and going from Homecoming, starring Clark Gable and Lana Turner in 1948. George built model ships. It was one of the things that he did to calm himself and relax himself. We have one on display. You'll see it right out in that display case. He built a multitude of these ships. Really, all by hand. Imagine, I mean, every little component is hand built and assembled. Well, one of my favorite photographs in the entire multiple boxes is this one, where George is attempting to photograph this boat. This, to me, is very Norman Rockwellian. We have two ladders with a string across suspending the boat. We have this big white thing in the background to try to provide a good background for the photograph. We have Andy Dean holding up a sheet, trying to block some of the sun. We have George standing on the ricketiest lawn chair you ever saw. We have daughter, Barbie, looking at the whole thing saying, "My God, am I adopted?" And way over here, we have Louise taking the picture. So I just think this is, and how is he going to get off of that chair? And finally, we have a mystery. I have no idea what they're trying to communicate to us here. Each is holding something apparently important to them. Andy, a baseball glove. George has his Time magazine. Barbie, a camera. And Louise, a red telephone. And they're leaving us with this enduring mystery. What are they doing? Someone said, is it their Christmas card? In the collection, we have pretty much all their Christmas cards. I don't think it was a Christmas card. But I'd love to figure it out, wouldn't you? There's a story there. Thank you for coming, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.